Well, hello everybody, it's Mobius Y here, coming at you live with some Stellaris Console. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, hello YouTube. Just give me one moment here. Okay, so this stream, or this video if you're watching on YouTube, it's going to be the first of its kind. It's going to be a little bit different. I am going to go over an Empire build with you. So I guess I'll call it an Empire Spotlight or something. I don't really know. I'll title it something that the Empire strives for. Right now I largely just give it really stupid names. This is the Wanna Get Enslaved Empire. The species is the delicious slave. Plural, they are delicious slaves, and the adjective is delicious slaver. Yo, dog, I heard you like high food and mineral production. So that's essentially what this empire goes for, where you have a caste system that automatically enslaves people on a mining network or hydroponics farm. And you double down on those slaves, and you make them extremely productive to generate lots of minerals and lots of food. So lots of minerals is always really good. You can build buildings whenever you want. You can build lots of ships fairly quickly and make yourself a big fleet. You can build lots of orbital research and mining stations. And lots of food is really good too, because it prevents your empire from starving. Whenever you run out of food and your empire is starving, the happiness of your empire completely tanks. And bonus food also increases things like growth speed, so they can help with planets that still have empty tiles with growing organic pops on them. So it's very useful. So we've got the delicious slaves on their home world, which is an Arctic world. We got slaves bring the kids. Now, when I go through this and essentially how this empire is built and how you want to play it, I actually have some save files where we'll check out different stages of the game at certain points. I have a save right at the very beginning at 0 years, so we'll check out what we'll kind of go through what you'll probably want to be doing when you first start a game with this empire or this particular empire build. And then I've got two save files, one at 20 years and one at 50 years. So we'll check out what was going on at those points in the game, as well as the good and you know, it should give you a better idea of the good and bad aspects of this particular empire build. The good obviously being utilizing those slaves to maximum effect. And then at the very end, I'll go in and I'll actually show you the normal, quote-unquote normal empire that I created with this exact same setup, just without the ridiculous names, essentially. So how we made maximum use of these slaves is in the species traits. Because the slaves are on mining networks and hydroponics farms, we want to give them both the agrarian and the industrious traits. This gives them plus 15% food and mineral production anytime you put one of these delicious slaves species on a tile with one of those two buildings. Another thing that is really useful is the communal trait. This increases happiness by 5%. The one downside to having slaves all the time is that they're largely unhappy unless you compensate for that pretty significantly. So in order to combat that a little bit, you can take the communal trait, which will increase their happiness by an additional 5%, even though they're slaves. Lots of slaves on a planet with nothing to really increase their happiness or deal with their unrest could cause a revolt on that planet, and you may very well lose control of it. So this will help deal with that. There are other ways in game to increase happiness and reduce unrest as well, but you know, for now we're just going to go through setting up your empire. Now, for negative traits, we needed quite a bit to offset all these positives. with these 3 traits, this would put our trait points into the -3 zone. So we need 2 red traits in order to put that back to 0. One of them is obviously going to be non-adaptive because it gives you back 2 trait points, putting us at -1 trait points. And then we took decadent, which puts us back to 0 trait points. Decadent is not really a must-have. You could pick something like deviance, which is actually, as I said in a previous tips and strategies video, it's actually a positive red trait. But decadent really pays off in this kind of empire build because your empire has slaves. All you need to do in order for your planet to not suffer a 10% happiness penalty is make sure there is just one tile with slaves on it. And I'll show you what you want to do in order to ensure that. It's essentially just putting one type of building on there that ensures you have at least one slave pop on that planet. And then that planet does not suffer this 10% penalty. So you can put decadent on here. Just as much for role playing as well as for practical use. Apart from that, nothing else really applies. You definitely don't want to take things like slow breeders or slow learners. Weak would be a terrible pick because it has reduced mineral output and it counteracts your industrious trait. So you don't really want to bother with that. Solitary, don't take that one because that reduces the overall happiness. You can't take it anyways if you pick communal. So if you go with something other than communal or you just don't pick communal, then definitely don't take solitary in order to counteract your positive traits, because that will mean you will have less happy slaves and it will increase the unrest that they generate on all of your planets. And as I said, deviance is actually a red trait that you could pick instead of decadent if you really wanted to. But for the sake of using slaves, we're going to stick with decadent just for funsies. So let's take a look at the empire. Your government and ethics. Fanatic authoritarian. This reduces the resettlement cost by 50%, which usually requires a certain amount of influence in order to move a pop from one planet to another. But more importantly, your slave unrest is reduced by 20%, which is really nice to counteract your unhappy slaves, just like the slight boost in happiness. Now, this allows you to have a caste system species policy. This is what causes your hydroponics farms and mining networks to initially automatically enslave the pops on those tiles. You can, of course, reform your government to completely change this so that you either don't have slaves whatsoever, or to have it so that you have to manually select your slaves as opposed to having them automatically enslaved depending on what kind of building they're placed. And the other ethic, spiritualist, because this gives you governing ethics attraction plus 15%, so it's a little more difficult for your pops to lean towards different ethics because you kind of want to keep these two. And it decreases overall unrest by another 10. So really handy there between the extra 20% slave unrest reduction with your fanatic authoritarian, and your a flat -10 unrest because of your spiritualist ethic. It helps combat the unhappiness of your slaves quite a bit. Now, because you took fanatic authoritarian, you have to have a type of autocratic government. So that means either a dictatorship or a monarchy. Now, the reason why I just stuck with a dictatorship in this instance is nothing specific. You could change that if you so wanted to and go with a monarchy. That simply gives you access to a different kind of civic. Imperial cult civic, but we're not using that anyways, so dictatorship works just fine as well. This gives you a little more control over what your replacement ruler is once your current one dies. Now, for your civics, you're starting off with slaver guilds. This increases slave food and mineral output by an additional 10% each. And your second civic, mining guilds, increases empire minerals production by an additional 10%. There isn't one to increase food production, as we can see, we'll go through the list here. There is not a civic that increases Empire food production here in the civic picks. About the only one that you could change it to is Agrarian Idyll, where you have to be some degree of pacifist and non-authoritarian, and all that does is your farms also produce unity. But we don't care about that. We want to increase resource production. So slaver guilds and mining guilds together increases your minerals production by an additional 20%, and slaver guilds increases food output by an additional 10%. So that's pretty much it for how you want to build this empire. Everything else is largely fluff. We'll go into it with a little more detail down the road. The appearance of the species is molluscoid. Oops, sorry. The appearance of the species is molluscoid, as you can see it in this option here. So therefore, I went with molluscoid-looking ships and nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles for our starting weapons. We're going to be starting on our homeworld. We got slaves, bring the kids, and the star name is Heard You Like Slavery. So let's just back out of this and load the game. As I said, we're going to take a look at this empire at 0 years, and then 20 years, and then 50 years. So here we go. Productive Slaves Part 1, 0 years. Let's take a look at how this is starting off. So there are a couple advantages to having slaves on your planet beyond just potentially making them extremely productive. Slaves live in impoverished conditions, which means that their upkeep, instead of being 1.0 like this pop, which is on the planetary administration, you can see in the very bottom here, its upkeep is 1 unit of consumer goods, which is a cost of 0.5 minerals every month. Slaves only have an upkeep of 0.75 because they live in impoverished conditions. So that reduces their mineral cost every month down to 0.37. And they more than compensate for that with the amount of minerals that you can get your slaves to produce. For example, this slave, at the very beginning of the game, he's on a tile that produces 2 minerals by default. The mining network produces another 2 minerals, and because the planetary administration is right next to him, he's getting another mineral generated every month just from that. But wait, there's more. We have the industrious trait generating another plus 15% on top of that base 5. We've got chattel slavery. Slavery always produces an additional 10% minerals and food. And the planet itself, because of the slaver guild's civic and the mining guild's civic, we've got another 10% twice over there. So we're generating an additional 45% minerals per month on this one tile alone. That's why he is creating 7.25. Excuse me, 7.25 every month. One moment, please. Ugh, too much talking, not enough water. So yeah, that is a very productive tile right there, right off the bat, getting a decent amount of minerals off of a single tile. Now we go over to the other side. There is a tile with 2 pieces of food. The hydroponics farm is generating another 3 for a total amount of 5. With the adjacent planetary administration, we're getting another 1 for a total of 6. Now we add the modifiers. The agrarian trait, 15%. Chattel slavery, 10%. And the planet slaver guilds, the slaver guild civic for another 10% for a total of an additional 35% food production. So on top of the base 6, we've got another 2.1 units of food being generated every month by these slaves on this hydroponics farm. So that helps out with our food production quite a bit. At the top there, you can see it's a total of plus 6 at this point, which is pretty good. Now, because it's a caste system in our society, if we go over here, go to the Society tab and check out Policies. Oh, wait, no, sorry, my mistake. We go to People, and we go to Species, Select, Set Rights, check out their citizenship. It's a caste system. This automatically enslaves pops that are placed on tiles that produce food or minerals. Now, this is a little bit of a miswording here, because this does not include one of the buildings that produces food, which is the Paradise Dome. And the Paradise Dome is important to this empire itself. as well. We'll get to that a little bit lower. Enslaved pops have lower living standards. So this forcibly causes pops to become enslaved. When you place them on tiles with no buildings that generate some minerals or some food or both, even some tiles that generate energy credits and minerals, they'll still be enslaved. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if that's true. I do believe they still get enslaved even if there is energy credits and minerals on that tile and you don't place a building. But now I'm second guessing myself. It doesn't matter. Let's just say it's 50-50. They might not be enslaved. They might be enslaved. I do believe they get enslaved because of the minerals on that tile. But more on that later. And because we're fanatic authoritarian, the only other thing we can do is full citizenship, which is simply not allowed because we need productive slaves and we need to counteract that decadent trait that our species has. So other things like putting them on science labs and stuff like that, it has no effect on them whatsoever. And power plants, they're not enslaved either. So you can still put pops on these kind of tiles or buildings to generate things like power or generate another kind of resource like science. Just be aware that if you are moving a pop from a tile where they were enslaved to a different tile, actually we could test that. If you move them to a different tile where they're no longer enslaved, it still affects their overall happiness. It tends to have a negative modifier where it says, oh, they already have a low happiness because they are enslaved, and then if you move them off of a tile where they are enslaved to a different one, they'll have a happiness modifier that says was enslaved, and it makes them lose, I think, about 10% happiness, and it sticks with them for a little bit. But eventually it does go away. So let's take this guy, move him on here. Okay, so see, I was wrong. I'm okay with that. Putting these guys on a tile with energy credits and minerals does not automatically enslave them. However, if it has minerals and food, obviously it does enslave them. If it has just minerals or just food, it will also enslave them. So this should be visible here. Huh, that's interesting. That's very, very interesting. I fully thought that we would be able to show off the was enslaved thing. Maybe if we move this guy here. No, okay, whatever. Well, I wish that was working so I could show you an example of what that looks like when you move an enslaved pop off of that tile. So let's take a look at our research. Things you kind of want to pick right to start off. Solar panel network is never too bad. Society, you can definitely get hydroponics farms pretty early. We'll just pick planetary unification in this case. And then in your engineering, you can definitely start to get things like powered exoskeletons, which will increase your mineral generation by another 5% on top of the bonuses you already have. So really cranking in that mineral production very early in the game. This can give you a good head start on your minerals. So let's take a look-see here. I'm pretty sure this was a 600-star ring world, and I only had like one other empire spawn in it. So you would do the normal thing, split up your corvettes, send them out throughout the galaxy to start exploring, see what they encounter, blah, blah, blah. But I think we're just going to jump ahead here. So let's go to the next save file. 20 years into the game. Productive Slaves Part 2. So hopefully as we're going through this, you guys are getting a gist of how you'll want to play this particular empire. So here, 20 years in, we have a colony. Right now it is named Biram Prime, but I do believe that does get renamed pretty quickly here. Also, we have some other things that happened in the game that I forgot to mention at the very beginning. We adopted a bunch of traditions. We're almost done with the harmony traditions. Why do harmony first? Well, when you adopt it, the happiness of all your pops is increased by 10%. Also, The second thing you want to pick is the greater good. This reduces unrest by -20 on all your planets, further counteracting the unrest generated by your unhappy slaves. And then the third thing you pick is the Paradise Dome. This is the Utopian Dream pick in the Harmony tree. The Paradise Dome generates food and a little bit of unity, and it also creates extra happiness on a planet that you place it. It's planet unique. You can only place one, but it makes a pretty big difference, to the point where by the time you finish the Harmony tree and you're at this stage in the game, your slaves are borderline happy. There's also obviously some other good picks here in the Harmony tree. Mind and body, increased leader lifespan by 20 years. Kinship, negative impact on governing ethics. Attraction caused by distance from capital is reduced by 50%. That's not as big of a deal. It just means that your pops will still lean towards being fanatic authoritarian spiritualists, as they already are. And lastly, the Bulwark of Harmony. Whenever you're in a defensive war, your ship build speed is increased by 33%, and the fire rate of your ships is upped by 15% for ships within your borders. And of course, finishing the Harmony tradition reduces the mineral cost of consumer goods used by your pops by 15%. We'll get to more of that later. If you recall the upkeep required down here is pretty low for slaves, because they only require 0.75 units of upkeep per month because they are enslaved. Now, take a look. See here, we have the Paradise Dome. Generates 5 food per month. The tile already produces 1. It also produces another 2 unity. Now, because this pop on the Paradise Dome is not enslaved, we don't get nearly as many bonuses on the food production on this tile. However, the Paradise Dome itself does generate a lot of food. 5 food on the tile is pretty good. That's a fairly high level hydroponics farm. I believe a hydroponics farm 3 generates 5 units of food as well. As you can see here, the hydroponics farm 2 only generates 4. So a Paradise Dome this early, make sure you put one of these on each of your planets. You'll be generating a decent amount of food, compensating for every planet that you colonize. So let's take a look at a couple of our slaves. Let's take a look at these guys. The happiness of the slaves. It's normally only 50%, and then because they're enslaved, it's -20%, and then impoverished conditions -10%. So they're normally pretty miserable. They're normally at about 20% happiness, which would generate some unrest. However, because we have the communal trait, which increases the happiness by 5%. We have the Paradise Dome, which increases happiness by 5%. And we have Harmony Traditions Adopted, which increases happiness by another 10%. They are 40% happy. So there's almost no unrest being generated. In fact, there is 0 being generated because we have happy pops, no unhappy slaves. And of course, happiness also positively impacts production. If you could get this happiness even higher, you're generating more resources, especially on things like your power plants. Happiness plus 6% is adding to the total generation of energy credits on this tile. So that's always useful. So let's just take a look at a couple of our tiles here again. We've got this tile here, which was originally generating only, what was it, 7 point something minerals? I can't remember now. But this is now a grade 2 mining network, still generating 2 minerals on the tile, 3 from the mining network, and plus 1 from the adjacent planetary administration. So we've got the industrious trait with powered exoskeletons for a total of 20% chattel slavery, 30% slaver guilds, 40% mining guilds, another 10% for a total of 50%. So this tile, this pop, I should say, is generating another 3 minerals per month just from those bonuses. So very, very productive. Now, actually, one thing I didn't really mention or think of is that you could actually forcibly enslave this pop that is on your Paradise Dome. This would make them a slave, and you would still get all the benefits of having the Paradise Dome on the planet. You would get a little bit of unity generation, and the pop would actually be generating more food than it is right now because it is a slave. So what else do we got going on here? Well, there is a building that you want to pick up from doing society research. It is called the Slave Processing Facility. You want to find this one as quickly as possible. Don't ask me what it takes to get to it. I'm pretty sure it is a tier 3 research project. And we'll take a look here. We'll go to the research tree, society. Here it is, neural implants. So this gives you access to the slave army, which deals more damage and morale damage and has more health, more base health, but requires more maintenance than a regular deployed army. But this is what also gives you access to the slave processing facility. It's a tier 2 technology, hence the cost. It says 696 here, but that's because I've colonized a planet. We got some pops going on. The slave processing facility produces 2 minerals and 2 units of food every month. That is the base amount that it produces. However, the big thing is the additional slave mineral and food output, 10% from each of those, and it reduces slave unrest by a further 50%. So the ideal spot to place this building is on a tile that already produces a little bit of minerals and a little bit of food every month. As you can see, the tile that I placed this slave processing facility on produces 1 mineral and 2 food every month by default. So with the slave processing facility, we throw that on there and it generates 4 minerals and 5 food every month. This also adds more modifiers to your food and mineral production for the rest of the planet, for the rest of your enslaved pops, making them very productive indeed. So let's just go ahead and jump ahead to the 50-year mark here. What else is going on in this empire? Repairing our fleets. Looks like they were just in a battle. We have a destroyer researched, so beefing up our fleets there. And as you can see, our mineral generation is pretty decent. It's still being used up by a fair amount of ship maintenance, but that's not a big deal. And we got quite a bit of food production. It's increasing our pop growth by 43%, which is pretty dang good. So let's go ahead and take a look at the final save. Productive Slaves Part 3. So this is 50 years into the game. It's actually not exactly 50 years because I missed the opportunity to save at exactly the first day of the first month of the 50th year. As you can see, it's 7 months and 19 days in, but that's not a big deal. So where are we at this point? We have some cruisers in our fleet. We're beefing up our fleet with some decent technology. Our spaceports are up to level 5. We're adding some cruiser assembly yards. We're building some destroyers, and we have a 3rd planet. So with all these planets colonized, look at this food production we've got, plus 47.25. This is increasing our pop growth by 69%. So any new colonies we make, the pop growth will be quite substantial with any other bonuses. Any society research projects that you've completed to increase pop growth. If you had the rapid breeders trait with this as well, your pops would go pretty decently fast. And every month we are generating 82.82 minerals. That's not a huge amount, but that number simply gets exponentially higher as time goes on. So back at our capital world, we got slaves, bring the kids. This tile is now generating 12 minerals every month. It's still got the mining network 2, which only produces 3. The tile itself produced 2, and the adjacent planetary capital has it producing an additional 2. So that's a total of 7 minerals. However, with the industrious trait for plus 15%, powered exoskeletons for plus 5%, the mineral processing plant on the planet for another plus 10%, chattel slavery for another plus 10%, and then we have a governor with the iron fist trait, as you can see here, which increases slave output by another 10%. We have the Slaver Guild's civic, increasing minerals by another plus 10%. We have a slave processing facility on the planet, plus 10%. And we have the Mining Guild's civic, another plus 10% mineral generation. That is a total of 70% additional minerals generated on this tile. So that's adding another 5.6 minerals generated every month. Hence why we're getting so many off of this tile alone. Let's take a look at this guy. 12.4 units of food produced every month. The hydroponics farm 2 produces 4. The tile itself produces 2. The adjacent planetary capital adds another 2 every month. We have the agrarian trait for another plus 15%. Chattel slavery for another plus 10%. The governor with the iron fist trait, another plus 10%. Slaver guilds, another plus 10%. And the slave processing facility on the planet, another plus 10%, for a total of plus 55% extra food production. The tile itself is only producing 8 additional food, but all those bonuses have it producing another 4.4 units of food every month, hence the high production. This is pretty... You see what I'm getting at here? You got some pretty productive slaves going on here if they're increasing their production by at least plus 50% for food and mineral production across the board. If you do this on all your planets, you will have some very high mineral generation with pretty decent growth speed because of all the extra food you're producing every month as well. You could also increase this food storage by going to your policies. Go to the society, go to your policies tab, take food stockpiling either to balanced to increase the maximum food storage capacity to 1,000, or do large, which I recommend you eventually do anyways, to increase your food storage to plus 5,000. So that will quickly stave off any hunger if your empire should suffer some sort of catastrophe. So we have a whole bunch of tools at our disposal to combat the unrest that would normally be generated by slaves, to make them a little bit happier, so that they're not creating unrest and risking rebellion on your planet. And we have all sorts of modifiers in place to make these slaves really productive, generating a lot of food and a lot of minerals for you at all times. So on all of your planets, you don't necessarily want to specialize that particular planet unless that planet has a certain modifier. For example, this one that gives it an additional plus 20% engineering science output. This would be a pretty good planet to place a lot of science labs on. However, you still have to have at least one tile with something like the slave processing facility that has a slave pop on it. So I recommend on every planet, take a look, see which tile generates a little bit of minerals and a little bit of food on it, or maybe just generates a fair bit of one of those two. Throw a slave processing facility on that tile, put a pop on it. That pop will be enslaved to counteract the decadent traits so that your pops stay happy, and it'll add a little bit of mineral and food generation. The food generation is kind of more important in my opinion, because you don't necessarily want too many planets, if any, in the red for food generation, and that would leave you open to mostly planting things like engineering labs or any other science lab on this planet to increase your science output. Now remember that power plants do not automatically enslave your pops. You could forcibly enslave them by doing this, hitting that slavery button. Okay, well, never mind, it's not working. If you so chose, you could forcibly enslave certain pops. Just keep in mind that the civics and the species traits that we picked were tailored specifically towards generating lots of minerals and lots of food production. So keep that in mind as you play this empire. So not much else going on here. It's not like we've been at war with anybody. We have encountered the lone alien species that I made in this. I largely just made this game so that I could play it for a bit and show off what happens in this particular empire, and basically give you an idea of how you want to play it. This setup, I would say this setup is quite beneficial to people who like playing wide empires, because the increased mineral and food generation can help with things like your growth speed, keeping your pops fed, and having all those minerals coming in just allows you to build lots of buildings when you need them to, as well as build lots of ships to top off that naval capacity. Your naval capacity will skyrocket as you colonize lots of planets within your first 50 to 100 years and build spaceports on them. So having lots of minerals coming in will allow you to generate more minerals. As you can see here, I started the discovery tree, and just started working towards maybe improving the science of it. But another good one to do, especially if you are playing wide, the expansion tradition tree, because completing it increases your core sector systems by 2. It also helps with the growth on your new colonies. They start with 1 additional pop, and they do you can pick other things like increase your pop growth speed even further by picking a new life option in the expansion tradition tree. So those are always good options too. Now, one thing I almost forgot to mention: by finishing the harmony tree, it reduces the cost of our consumer goods on all of our pops by 15%. So let's take a look at our capital planet. We got slaves, bring the kids. We don't have many pops on gotta enslave them all yet, and more slaves please, so we're not going to worry about that. And we've been looking at the capital for this whole time anyways. So sorry, if we look at a non-enslaved pop here, they're pretty happy. On their own, they're pretty happy with the communal trait, plus the Paradise Dome on the planet. And I actually have an edict enabled called Improved Energy Initiative, which increases happiness by an additional 5%, but also boosts research speed on a couple categories of research, namely industry and materials. So we've got improved happiness across the board because of all that good stuff, and finishing the harmony traditions increases that by another, adopting the harmony traditions increases that by another plus 10%. So on a regular pop where the upkeep requirement is 1.0, normally this costs 0.5 minerals per month, but the 15% reduction from finishing harmony traditions makes our regular unenslaved pops only costing 0.44 minerals per month. Now let's take a look at one of our slaves, which already only has an upkeep requirement of 0.75 because they live in impoverished conditions. This drops their mineral requirement for basic survival down to 0.33. So it makes them just even cheaper to have slaves. So don't worry about having a planet that is almost entirely made up of slaves, namely a planet that generates a lot of food. If you find a planet with a modifier that boosts food production by, 15%, 25% on that planet, something like that, and you just build a boatload of hydroponics farms, and you're worried about those pops. You're worried about a lot of those pops, and the upkeep that's required to maintain them, they're pretty cheap. 0.33 minerals per month per slave. That's not so bad. That's actually a fairly cheap pop to be looking after. So finishing the harmony traditions and reducing the consumer goods cost is just yet another way to help improve your overall minerals production, because it reduces the drain from the consumer goods, which just means more minerals in your bank. So I think that will largely sum up this empire. Productive slaves. It's a doable strategy, and it's actually a pretty interesting way to play. By the time you hit year 100, or especially when you get in the late game, about 150 to 200 years in, you'll just be raking in minerals, and you should not have to worry about your pops starving, because your food generation will be really high, and hopefully with the stockpile being full, it will be helping increase the growth speed on your pops for your new worlds and whatnot. So I'm just going to quit back to the main menu. The base, not the base, but the original empire that I created with this particular setup I called it the Mandate of Segeth. So I'm going to open this up in the customization menu and just go through these tabs one by one. Feel free to pause the video if you're watching this on YouTube. Just pause it for a couple seconds on each of these screens so that you can take a look at what the picks are, and you can essentially copy this empire for yourself and take it for a spin. Let me know what happens in the comments below if you play this empire. Also, how you feel about playing with slaves and your pops in Stellaris. This has been Always Why. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys on the next stream or in the next video for Stellaris Console Edition. Take care and have a great weekend.